The frozen forests of Europe held secrets no man on either side of the war could have imagined. It was late 1944, and though the tide had begun to turn against Germany, the Wehrmacht still clung to the idea that their discipline, their experience, and their fearsome tanks gave them the edge. But there was something hidden inside the olive-green machines rolling steadily under the white snow, a quiet advantage, not of steel or armor, but of voices carried through the ether. American Sherman tanks had radios that could talk to one another, and this invisible power would prove more devastating than any gun barrel. Lieutenant James O'Connor knew the truth better than most. At just 23, he was far younger than the gray-haired commanders he answered to, but he had one thing many of them did not. He trusted the new technology humming inside his tank. For James, the radio wasn't just wires and dials. It was a lifeline, a whisper in the storm of chaos, a thread that stitched men together when the world around them was ripping apart. On a freezing December morning, James and his crew of 5 were crawling through the Ardennes, engines rumbling low, breath hanging in clouds inside the cramped metal beast. Snowflakes clung to their uniforms, and fear was as thick as the frost on the steel. The Germans had unleashed a counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Americans were caught off guard. Entire units were cut off. The sky was gray, the trees were bare, and death seemed to stalk the woods. But James had something the Germans didn't suspect. When his tank crept to a ridge and he saw enemy armor, panthers and tigers, positioning themselves with their barrels aimed at the valley, his stomach clenched. He knew they were outgunned. A Sherman was a lighter tank, often ridiculed as a Ronson, a lighter that lit up when hit. But James had faith in the voice that crackled through his headset. "Eagle 1, this is Falcon 3. Do you read me?" Came the voice of Captain Miller, calm, firm, and reassuring despite the hell breaking loose. "I read you, loud and clear," James replied, fingers brushing the dials. That phrase, loud and clear, was more than military jargon. It was survival. It meant that the American tanks weren't alone, weren't scattered, weren't deaf in the fog of war. They were a chorus, moving as one. The Germans didn't know this. Their tanks still relied on runners, men carrying orders from one armored beast to another, or on crude signaling systems. A commander in one Panther couldn't simply tell the others, "Shift left, flank them, cover me." They had to guess, wave flags, or wait for messages that came too late. In the split seconds of tank warfare, that delay was death. James adjusted his periscope. 2 Panthers, bearing northwest. They're setting up an ambush. His voice was steady, but inside his heart thumped like the engine pistons. Captain Miller's voice shot back instantly. "Copy that, Falcon 3. Hold position. Falcon 2, swing wide east. Falcon 4, prepare to fire on my mark." Within moments, tanks that had seemed scattered became a deadly fist. They moved not as individuals, but as a pack, each knowing exactly what the others saw. James's crew followed orders, his driver grinding gears as the Sherman shifted left, his gunner adjusting aim. The German Panthers never suspected that every move they made was already being countered. The first volley thundered. American shells screamed across the valley. One Panther burst into flames before it had even fired a shot. Another tried to back into cover, but James's tank and another Sherman's had it in a deadly crossfire. The German crews fought bravely, but they were blind compared to the Americans. They were lions, but lions trapped in cages they couldn't see. When the smoke cleared, James's hands trembled on the radio. "Targets neutralized," he reported. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the weight of what had just happened. Men had died, on both sides. He knew that for every tank burning, there were soldiers who had mothers, wives, children. But he also knew that if not for the radio, his own men would be the ones lying in the snow. That night, huddled inside the tank, James couldn't sleep. The radio sat there, silent, wires coiled like veins across the steel interior. He stared at it, realizing it wasn't just a machine. It was a bond, a reminder that no one had to fight alone. War taught brutal lessons, and one of them was clear. Men could endure almost anything if they had a voice to guide them, to remind them they were part of something bigger than themselves. Weeks passed, and the radios proved their worth again and again. There were times when tanks moved through fog so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. To the Germans, fog was confusion. To the Americans, it was an opportunity. Radios turned blindness into vision, chaos into coordination. But war was never just about machines. It was about men. James wrote letters home whenever he could, scrawling with numb fingers. To his mother in Ohio, he confessed his fears but also his hope. "Mom," he wrote, "these radios, we're not just fighting tanks, we're fighting silence. And for once, we're winning. The Germans never hear us coming because they don't understand what it means to be connected, to be united." His mother kept those letters, pressing them flat and praying over them. She didn't know the details of radios or tanks, but she understood the deeper truth. Communication saved lives, whether on the battlefield or at the dinner table. One bitter January morning, James's unit was ordered to hold a crossroads. The Germans wanted it, needed it to keep supply lines alive. The Shermans rolled in, engines growling, radios alive with chatter. James could hear fear in some voices, determination in others. But there was one voice he clung to, Captain Miller's. Calm, unshaken, even when artillery rained down. The Germans came hard, their Tigers leading the charge. James's crew braced themselves. His gunner, Eddie, whispered a prayer. The loader, Thomas, kissed a photo of his daughter before shoving another shell into the breach. Then the radio crackled. "All units, fire on my mark." Mark. Cannons roared as one. The Shermans unleashed hell, coordinated so tightly that the Germans thought they faced an entire division. In reality, it was a handful of tanks moving like a single organism. The Tigers fought fiercely, their armor thick, their guns deadly, but they were isolated. They couldn't call for help, couldn't shift tactics fast enough. They were strong, but they were deaf. When the battle ended, James sat in silence, heart pounding. They had held the crossroads. The ground was littered with smoke, twisted steel, and the cost of victory. He picked up the radio handset and whispered, "We made it." In that moment, he realized the radio was more than military hardware. It was a symbol of life itself. How many families back home had suffered because they couldn't talk, couldn't communicate? How many fathers never told their sons they were proud? How many husbands never told their wives they were sorry until it was too late? War had stripped life to its essence, and James saw the lesson plainly. Voices mattered. Silence killed, connection saved. When the war finally ended, James came home, not unscarred, but alive. He never looked at a telephone the same way again. Every ring was a reminder of those nights in the Sherman, waiting for a voice that meant survival. He became a teacher, standing in front of classrooms filled with young men who had no idea what it meant to hear death whistle overhead. He told them history, yes, but also something deeper. Don't waste the gift of speaking, boys. Don't waste the chance to listen. Wars don't just happen because men hate each other. They happen because men stop talking to each other. Years later, when his own son grew restless and distant, James didn't let silence fester. He knocked on his son's door, sat on the edge of the bed, and talked. Really talked. About fear, about mistakes, about love. His son listened, surprised, and slowly opened up. That night, James thought of the radios again, the invisible thread that had once kept him alive. Now it kept his family whole. The Germans had never understood the secret of the Shermans. They thought war was won with steel, fire, and fear. But James knew better. Victory was carried on unseen waves, on the power of voices that refused to go silent. For the rest of his life, whenever someone asked him how the Americans beat the Germans, he didn't mention guns or numbers. He smiled, touched his ear as if still hearing the crackle of his headset, and said, "Because we could hear each other." And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. In war, in families, in friendships, silence is the enemy. If we want to survive, not just as nations, but as people, we must keep the lines open, keep the voices alive. It's not the strongest or the smartest who endure, but those who stay connected, who remember that no one wins alone. James carried that truth until his final breath. On his bedside table sat a small, battered headset, the one he had used in the Ardennes. To his children, it was just a relic of war. To him, it was the reason he had lived long enough to hold them, love them, and tell them stories. And so the old soldier closed his eyes, his final thoughts drifting not to tanks or battles, but to the voices that had once cut through the storm, saving him, saving his men, teaching him the greatest truth of all, that communication is not just power, it is life itself.